Thank you very much. It's a great honor, and I'm humbled to talk to this illustrious crowds and have the opportunity also to add ICRC's perspective to the migration discussions that you had today. I had the opportunity over the last 2 hours to listen into the conversation, and I'll try to build some bridges between humanitarian and other perspectives which have been discussed during the day. There are few population groups more vulnerable than refugees and other forcibly displaced people. Every day in different parts of the world, the International Committee of the Red Cross sees firsthand the suffering that pushes people to flee their homes in search of safety. Others leave a safe place in search of better prospects abroad, but then face similar hardships en route and upon arrival. Being forced to leave one's home is always tragic, and the journey is paved with insecurity. Whatever the reasons for leaving their country, whether it is due to armed conflicts or other situations of violence, persecution, human rights violations, poverty, or the effects of climate change, thousands of people will not survive the migration journey. Countless others simply go missing, creating enormous distress for the families who are left waiting for answers. Others also risk being detained, trafficked, abused, extorted. They may become trapped in a country affected by armed conflict or other types of violence and face great threats. The initial tragedy meets more tragedy. And I wanted to highlight what just before the break Axel mentioned in the panel, that these are people who need our assistance and protection. The Libyan context is exemplary. Migrants from sub-Saharan Africa looking for economic opportunities on the continent or beyond in Europe are joined by those fleeing armed conflicts in the Sahel and in Libya itself. We see migrants, including refugees, who had settled in places that used to be safe, forced to move on, while an increasing number of Libyans are displaced internally within their own country. No matter whether someone is a refugee, asylum seeker, or migrant, it is vital that people's needs and their protection remains at the center of our attention. And this is the key message of my presentation today on responsibilities of states. For states, the trigger of people's movements are critical, be they economic, political, security, as they have a bearing on the applicable legal regimes that states apply and on the policies they define. But for the ICRC, for humanitarian organization, what matters first are people's vulnerabilities. No one should be left unprotected and unassisted when they need help, regardless of their legal status. Humanity and dignity must be the guiding principles of migration policy, and a humanitarian response to migrants' needs must come first. Vulnerabilities and rights must not be pitted against each other in political arguments over legal status. And here again, I can refer to the panel I listened in just a minute ago beforehand. Of course, over time, we have to have a serious conversation on how we define dignity and what the standards and criteria for dignity are. Dear colleagues, let us not forget, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Syria crisis that brought an increasing number of refugees to the European Union, strained EU solidarity and sparked a new area of stigmatization of migrants driven by political rhetoric and misinformation. On my reading list over the New Year break was a book titled Terra Incognita 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years, from researchers Robert Muga and Ian Golden. They tell, amongst others, the story of global migration from a historic perspective, pointing out that the recent levels of migration are not particularly unusual, especially compared to the mid to late 19th century migration. Their aim is to present the hard facts and not to hyperventilate the headlines that scapegoat migrants. And it is critical that evidence-driven policymaking, not hysterical rhetoric or politics of fear, are applied in this situation. The audience today would be well versed in these facts. Globally, people tend to settle close to their home countries. Roughly 9 in 10 African migrants, for instance, never leave the continent of Africa. 80% of refugees and asylum seekers live in countries next to their country of origin, not in North America, Europe, or Australia. And let's not forget that today the internally displaced or from conflict are twice as large as those who cross a border and become refugees. Take the Syrian crisis. The large majority of those forcibly displaced, 5.4 million people, are being hosted by neighboring low and middle income countries: Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt. Solidarity and responsibility is unevenly shared in the international system, despite the perceptions that there is a constant flow of migrants into Europe. Moreover, those moving beyond their region contribute overall positively, economically and socially, in historic and present-day perspectives to their countries of destination. And I understand also this was for me the big takeaway of the panel discussion that was just taking place a minute ago. The ICRC, as a humanitarian actor, takes a perspective based on humanitarian concern, legal frameworks, and practical solutions. We work with the other components of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement to ensure that vulnerable migrants, including refugees, receive the protection they are entitled to under international and domestic law, and that they can access the assistance required regardless of their legal status. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have undoubtedly seen people's vulnerabilities increase through compounding health, economic, and social issues. Vulnerable migrants are among the most exposed groups, particularly those living in overcrowded camps and urban slums with limited access to sanitation, hygiene, and basic health services. They have been disproportionately impacted by the economic repercussions of lockdown measures, given their heavy dependency on informal labor market and on the external support from host communities and the humanitarian actors. These measures have also increased the risk of neglect, abuse, exploitation, and violence, including sexual violence, particularly for women and children. Moreover, access to international protection has also been restricted due to the temporary blanket border closures put in place in several countries in response to the pandemic. Many have become stranded along border areas or in transit with insufficient access to essential services. The ICRC works to alleviate suffering, visiting detained migrants, maintaining and restoring family links along migration route, clarifying the fate and whereabouts of missing people, and supporting their families, and in the worst of cases, ensuring dignified handling of human remains and other forensic services. Additionally, we engage with states in a dialogue on humanitarian consequences and the impact of their migration and asylum policies on migrants' rights. States' responsibilities under legal frameworks are clear. Whether under international human rights law, refugee law, or other branches of international law as well as domestic law. Importantly, all migrants enjoy protection under human rights law. States have made these commitments in recognition of the fact that rights must be universally protected and that all individuals deserve protection. In armed conflict, migrants are also protected under international humanitarian law. Beyond this, refugee and asylum seekers also enjoy special protection under the Refugee Convention of 1951. States also need to take into account other non-binding instruments and standards, including the commitments they have undertaken under the global compacts. We recognize that states are challenged by the political, social, and economic dimension of migration. We also recognize that states have a legitimate right to regulate migration, but this right is not absolute. The picture is complex. How can people's status be properly determined in difficult mixed flows? How can vulnerable people be best protected when the reasons for their migration does not fit into current legal categories? How can people's protection needs be addressed beyond their legal status? When return are possible under international law, how can these be made sustainable and not lead to further suffering and circular migration? Responses to address such challenges cannot be limited to fulfill security imperatives or political discourses, but must be based on protecting people's dignities, rights, and fundamental freedoms, and must always uphold international law. These must recognize that in certain cases, persons who are not considered to be refugees may still be in need of assistance and protection, including against refoulement. Despite the remarkably generous practice of some states in hosting significant numbers of forcibly displaced people for decades, we are increasingly seeing a hardening of migration and asylum policies. Many states have adopted measures designed to prevent and deter foreign nationals from arriving on their territory, including through the adoption of restrictive admission and stay measures. Strict migration and containment policies may not only fail to curtail migration, they also compound people's vulnerabilities, forcing migrants, including refugees and others in need of protection, to take risky steps, such as resorting to smuggling networks or traveling along dangerous routes. Similarly, states' use of immigration detention as a deterrent or their failure to respond to life-threatening situations such as distress at sea, risks lives and creates suffering. With so many lives in jeopardy, it is clear that we urgently need better ways to respond. And the outside borders of the European Union, looking at Bosnia, looking at Greece, looking at Libya, at the Mediterranean, at the Canary Island, just illustrate that there is a huge room for improvement. The ICRC makes a series of recommendations to state. First, to respect and ensure respect of international humanitarian law, including for migrants caught in armed conflicts. When the law is violated, forced displacement, sometimes on a large scale, is triggered. Respecting the law can prevent the forced displacement of people both within their countries and across borders. It can also reduce the suffering of those already displaced and may allow them to return to their homes at an early stage. Respect for the rules can thus have a major impact on reducing the scale and suffering involved in displacement. And let's not forget in that context that 80% of all people forcibly displaced in the world today by violence come from countries at war and in which IHL, international humanitarian law, is often or systematically violated. In opposition of the argument, if the law were respected, we would have less irregular displacement by violence. Therefore, IHL rules, in particular those that protect civilian and civilian objects from the effect of hostilities, can also play an important role in reducing displacements, for instance, ensuring that civilian objects such as water systems, hospitals, schools, and homes are protected from attacks, which is critical for people to be able to stay at home. Humanitarian and assistance and protection have a profoundly stabilizing effect on irregular and uncontrolled migration movement. Secondly, states must ensure that migrants' rights are respected, in particular at their external borders, in line with their obligations under international, regional, and domestic law. When managing migration flows, whether at borders, in transit, or in destination countries, force may only be used as a last resort in line with the principles and requirements of legality, necessity, proportionality, precaution, and accountability. In all situations, states must comply with the principle of non-refoulement. Importantly, under international human rights law, non-refoulement extends to all individuals, irrespective of their legal status. It is generally recognized that it applies to admission and non-rejection at the border, interdiction or interception and rescue operations on the high seas. Thirdly, states should place the protection of migrants at the core of their migration and asylum policies. The protection of migrants and security issues are not mutually exclusive. In fact, policies that protect the rights of migrants can contribute to greater security and stability. Measures aiming at preventing irregular migration must preserve people's rights and ensure access to relevant services, to fair and effective asylum for those in need of international protection. We ask states to regularly review their policies to ensure they prevent family separations, migrations from going missing, and dying along migration routes. The international dimension of migration and the humanitarian consequences that certain policies may have on migrants along migratory routes should be factored into national migration and border control policies. Fourthly, detaining migrants for immigration-related reasons should be a measure of last resort. Liberty should be the norm. Immigration detention is not only harmful for individuals, it is also costly for societies. It is in the interest of states to avoid detention and identify non-custodial alternatives. When there are grounds for deprivation of liberty, states should end the detention of children and family separation for immigration-related reasons. Can I remind you that still hundreds of thousands of people today are held in immigration detention? Fifthly, migrants need to be included into economic, social, and health responses, in particular when we think about COVID-19. In the face of existing discrimination, migrants risk being blamed for the spread of the pandemic, exacerbating the risk of violence by xenophobic groups. States must ensure that migrants are treated humanely and protected against stigmatization and violence. Specific strategies of outreach are required to ensure their access to information, their inclusion in preventive measures, and their equal access to testing, healthcare, services, and vaccination. Including migrants, irrespective of legal status, in COVID-19 responses is not only essential to reduce the impact of pandemic on migrants themselves, but it also core to public health management to face today's pandemic. It is critical, too, that humanitarian work is protected in COVID responses and more broadly to ensure access to essential services for vulnerable migrants is unimpeded. For example, we are concerned about any requirement for service providers to report irregular migrants to law enforcement authorities or provide information for surveillance purposes. I do encourage states to implement these measures and urge them to respect their obligations, and in addition to strive towards coordinated and ambitious solutions at various levels, local, regional, and global. A collaborative approach is needed among states aimed at well-being of individuals and not to deter migrants and punish those who decide or are forced to leave their communities. States individually and collectively must adopt policies that do not exacerbate people's vulnerabilities and do all in their power to ensure people are protected. To make special note of the responsibility of liberal states, as you asked me to respond in today's keynote address, let me just say that given the strong and rights-based approach of liberalism, the perspective of individual protections that is intrinsically linked to liberalism, and given the importance of economic freedom in liberal thinking, and also given the critical and evidence-based approach liberalism has traditionally taken, one would expect liberal states to champion their obligations as described above. And not only this, but to recognize and promote the overall positive impact of migration on societies. In focusing on facts, not fiction, we can keep the proportions of problems based in reality, and state action can in turn be based in legality and humanity. In pushing the cursor towards protecting people in need rather than neglecting them, we can find practical solutions for real pressure points instead of using migrants and refugees as targets for ill-guided populism. In recognizing the importance of empowering refugees and migrants more generally, and also this was very much the red thread I picked up from the previous panel, we can allow them as soon as possible to fully contribute to our societies and economies. These are just a few elements and approaches, and I hope I have contributed with some thoughts, a humanitarian perspective to your very interesting and fruitful debates that I have listened in already during the afternoon. I thank you very much.
Peter Maurer, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, you have contributed very well. Thank you for your time and being with us today on the summit. Have a nice day.